Hi everyone, welcome. I'm really glad you could all join us here today. This is a really exciting collaboration with RSY-Netzer, LJY-Netzer, Noam, Habonim Dror, and of course Yachad Youth. So just before I introduce Rob, let me just introduce myself for those that don't know me. Let me introduce Yachad. So my name is Esther. I'm the youth and student worker at Yachad UK. For those that don't know, Yachad is a movement for British Jews. It's a pro-Israel, pro-peace movement. What does that mean? It basically means that we support the end of the occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian state for various different reasons, which I'm sure we will talk about over the length of this webinar. And we are really happy to work often in collaboration with the youth movements here today, RSY, LJY, Noam and Habo. So over the last couple of weeks, we have of course heard a lot about annexation in the news, in the international press, as well as Israeli national news. And we've heard uproar about what this means for those living in the region, as well as Jews in the diaspora, about what this proposed annexation of areas of the West Bank means. So there's been outroar amongst politicians from across the world, including many MPs in the UK from, across different parties, hundreds of former Israeli security officials, those really in the highest echelons of Israeli security have been calling out against proposed annexation, former ministers and members of the Knesset in Israel as well. And diaspora communities from across the UK. I am sure you have seen the letters which have been circulating and people being outraged at the lack of response from communal Jewish institutions as well. And in fact, a couple of days ago, I believe there was a poll which actually showed that the majority of Israelis do not support annexation as well. So this is a bit of background just before we kind of delve into the nitty-gritty of what this all means with Rob. So now's a really good time to introduce Rob. This is Dr. Rob Geist Pinfold over here. When Rob starts talking, you can kind of put it onto speaker view so that you just see Rob's face. So Rob is a visiting research fellow at the Department of War Studies and also a teaching fellow in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. Rob is actually based in Tel Aviv and is a postdoctoral research fellow in international relations at the University of Haifa. Previously, he served as a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and he also has a PhD in war studies from King's College London, as if all of that wasn't enough. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to hand over to Rob now, who's going to speak for 20-25 minutes or so, addressing the issue of annexation, the background, where we're at now, where it sits in the kind of current political environment in Israel. And then I might have a couple of questions. I know you guys, some of you have sent in questions previously, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Rob, handing over to you. If there is anything else that you would like to add to that absolutely gigantic bio, then please do.
No, that's more than enough. Thank you. You've done me a lot of favors with that.
So, handing over to Rob. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem, and thank you for inviting me. And fantastic to see so many young people here. Ready to talk about the implications of annexation, what it all means. So we're going to try and get to grips with that. And I promise I won't talk for longer than 20-25 minutes. I've even set myself a timer. Just as a disclaimer, before I get into the depths of annexation, I should point out that I have 2 cats roaming around the house somewhere. They do have a tendency to jump in on these Zoom calls and basically jump on my lap and cause all sorts of trouble. So if you hear some random meowing or whatever, please don't be too alarmed. I'm sure the situation is under control. Now then, on the subject of annexation, before I get onto what it means for Israel, what this policy actually is, and where it comes from, we have to actually start by zooming out a little bit and talking about what we mean by annexation in international law and practice. I'm sorry for starting this interesting talk about annexation with something that sounds quite boring, international law, but that is a good way to introduce yourselves to the topic. So I think it's very important to distinguish between annexation and occupation. You often hear the word occupation branded around a lot on campuses, in commentaries about Israel, but it's actually important to note that in an international legal perspective, annexation is actually much worse than occupation. Occupation is actually allowed for in international law. Organizations like the United Nations accept and recognize that states are going to occupy territory. When we talk about occupation, what we mean is when a state goes into a territory that isn't its own and applies control over that territory without annexing it, without applying its own sovereignty over that territory. So occupation is temporary. The idea is that you stay in this territory, you manage it for whatever reason, you try not to change too many things in that territory, and then you eventually leave. Annexation is very different because what you're basically saying is this territory is mine. I won't leave it. Nothing will make me leave it. This territory is an inalienable part of the state. In the same way, so we're talking about the West Bank in the same way that the West Bank is as much a part of Israel as Tel Aviv is a part of Israel, and we could never withdraw from Tel Aviv, and in the same way we could never withdraw from territory that we annex, like in the West Bank. So it's important to know, as I say, occupation is temporary, annexation is permanent. It's saying we are not going anywhere anytime soon. Now, what does that all mean when we're talking about the West Bank? So Israel's policy in the West Bank has basically been, since 1967, a policy of having its cake and eating it. Israel has not, apart from Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, annexed the West Bank. Israel has basically taken over the territory and controlled it. In this sense, it's occupying the West Bank. On the other hand, Israeli politicians and no Israeli government will tell you that Israel is occupying the West Bank because Israelis see themselves as connected to what they call Judea and Samaria. They see it as their own territory on the one hand. They see it as a sovereign, inalienable part of the state. But then, in terms of actual law and practice, it's not. It's a different territory. You know, Israel's liberal democracy and rule of law ends at the green line when you get into the West Bank. So Israel claims it's not occupying the West Bank, but it hasn't annexed the West Bank either. And in practice, it basically is occupying the West Bank, even if it's doing things like things that are naughty and not allowed in international law, like changing the status quo, like adding settlements, importing its civilian population. It is a de facto occupier of the territory. Though, as I say, that doesn't blend well with Israel's perception that it is already annexed and basically the territory is part of Israel. When we're talking about this current annexation bill that's being put forward by the Netanyahu administration, though, it's also important to know we're not talking about annexing the entire West Bank. We're not sure yet exactly what territory where is going to be annexed, but there is an Israeli consensus, even amongst the Israeli right. Even people like Naftali Bennett has said, I don't want to annex the whole West Bank, only certain parts of it. And this is because Israel, when it sees the West Bank, it has a real policy dilemma that has basically meant this policy since 1967 has been very confusing and contradictory. On the one hand, it's Judea and Samaria, our historic biblical home. It's part of Israel, or it should be part of Israel. On the other hand, there are 3 million Palestinians that live in the West Bank today. So if Israel were to annex the territory, it would be adding 2.8 million Palestinians into Israel itself, and therefore there's significant ramifications for Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, because the options once you do that are two things. Either you deny the Palestinians permanent rights, and you basically have one law for Jewish Israelis and Israeli Arabs, and another one for Palestinians that have become part of the state of Israel, or you give them full rights. And then, as I say, you add 3 million potential voters who who probably don't have a keen vision of Zionism and aren't keen on Zionism, to Israel's Jewish and democratic state. But in terms of the land that we're talking about, because of that, Israel has always had this confusing policy where it wants to control the land, but it doesn't want to control the Arabs on the land. It wants to have as little to do with the Palestinians as possible and as much sovereignty over the land. So when we're talking about annexation, Netanyahu's plan, it's probably going to be around 30% of the West Bank. A lot of talk that it's going to be the Jordan Valley and where the major settlement blocks are. So basically, it would be taking as much territory as possible with as few Palestinian Arabs as possible. In terms of timings and dates, we don't know when this is going to happen. The coalition agreement between, if you've been following Israeli politics, I'm sure you know we've had a whole bunch of upstarts lately, and Benjamin Gantz actually joining his rival, Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition. Part of that coalition deal is there will be no laws on bringing sovereignty to the West Bank, changing the status quo in the West Bank, apart from annexing around 30% of the territory, which will take place by the 1st of July at the latest. Now, what are the arguments for annexing this territory? Why would anyone want to do this? Well, first of all, I mentioned settlements. There are settlements in that part of the territory, the Jordan Valley, and the parts of the West Bank closest to Israel, the areas that are probably going to be first on the chopping block for annexation, have very large numbers of Jewish Israelis in them. These people all vote, they have a lot of political power, and they're very connected to the Netanyahu administration in the Likud party and his coalition partners. So there's a political incentive there for annexation. There's also this ideological incentive for annexation that I talked about, this idea that this is Judea and Samaria. We should have sovereignty over this land because it's an inherent part of who we are as Jews, as Zionists, and Israelis. And there's also a security argument that the right makes when annexing these territories. As I say, they want to have a minimum possible amount of Arabs, but there's also broader security ramifications. So the reason the settlements are where they are on the border near the Green Line and on the Jordan Valley, which is the eastern border of the West Bank between the West Bank and Jordan, is because these parts of the territory are perceived to have the highest security value. Along the border with Israel is more obvious because it provides what we call in Israel strategic depth. It basically pushes any potential threat of an enemy force controlling that territory further away from Israel. It makes it less likely that an invading Arab army would be able to threaten Israel's major urban centers, because Israel is actually very, very narrow, as many of you will know. In the middle, it's very, very narrow. And this narrow space of land where Israel's urban and commercial heartland is concentrated borders the West Bank. So there's always been a need to push that territory back, creating some sort of strategic depth. When we're talking about the Jordan Valley, the reason, because, you know, on the one hand, that's very far away, that's completely different. The reason that Israel wants to annex the Jordan Valley and has for a very long time is because it's feared that an invading Arab army could come straight through Jordan and then come straight into the West Bank and threaten this commercial and urban heartland of Israel. This actually happened before in the 1967 war. The Jordanians let the Iraqi army through Jordan into the West Bank, and therefore the Israelis had to push them back in order to secure the West Bank. And there's been a perpetual fear that this is going to happen, even with, you know, particularly, in fact, with the Arab Spring in 2011, people were saying, well, all these strong Arab regimes with whom we have peace treaties are suddenly not as strong as we thought. What if Jordan falls to the Islamic State? That means that ISIS could basically just go straight through the West Bank and threaten Israel. When we're talking about space and distances, it's a very, very small amount of territory, as many of you will know. It's only 30 kilometers from the Jordan Valley, from the eastern West Bank, straight to Jerusalem, Israel's capital. So this basically, Israel wants to make sure that it always controls the West Bank's borders. It wants to control the West Bank's borders that touch Israel, and it wants to touch control the West Bank's borders that touch other territories like Jordan. And finally, there's also a perception that is very, very predominant in Israeli politics lately, this idea that whenever we withdraw, we get rockets. And you'll hear this all the time if you talk to anyone on the street in Israel. You can stop them and ask them. It won't be long until you get this opinion. People say, look, we tried for peace. We tried leaving Gaza. We tried leaving Lebanon. All that it did was make everything worse for us. It made the security situation worse. We made these grand gestures towards peace, also the Oslo process in the early 90s. All we got in return was suicide bombings and rockets. And this is sort of the bedrock that the Netanyahu administration relies on, this perception that withdrawing from territory is fundamentally a national security risk and even an existential risk for Israel. When Israel's left territory in the past, for various reasons that we can go into on the Q&A, it's perceived that leaving territory would actually be better for Israel's security. Now, the current security situation, when we think about things like the Second Lebanon War in 2006 between Israel and Hezbollah, and when we think about the frequent flare-ups in the Gaza Strip between Israel, the IDF and Hamas, and the rockets that get sent into Israel, basically Israelis are saying, whenever we give up territory, things don't end well for us. So rather than just perpetuating the occupation, let's talk about annexing. Let's talk about extending our sovereignty here, making sure that these vital parts of the West Bank, which are essential for Israel's security, we never leave them. And that is, I'd say that's basically, if you talk about swing voters in Israel, that's something that's really attracted swing voters to the Likud and to Israel's right. It's less the sort of ideological religious argument about Judea and Samaria and the land of Israel, but that's certainly there and certainly present. What's most important in Israeli voters' minds is the issue and concept of security and things that make security, that increase Israel's security. Coming forward a bit more recently, in terms of political developments we've had not so long ago, why are we pursuing this now? Well, first of all, there's a political reason. Benjamin Netanyahu is Israel's longest serving prime minister. He's been in power for a very, very long time. It's sadly difficult for some of us to imagine a post-Netanyahu reality in Israel, as tragic as that sounds, because he's just been such a permanent fact in Israel's political arena. However, if I had to hazard a guess, I would say Netanyahu knows that his time is up relatively soon. He knows that he can't stay in power forever. Even Netanyahu will admit that he's not immortal. He can't, just stay in power for 120 years in Israel. He wants a legacy. Leaders, whenever they're resigning or coming to the end of their, especially great leaders coming to the end of their tenure, they want to have something that they can say, okay, I did this. This is my legacy that future generations will thank me for. And for the Israeli right, it's annexation. For Israel's left, it's often poor, saying my legacy is that I left these territories. For Israel's right, because of the security and ideological attachments to these territory, to these parts of the West Bank, annexation is fantastic for them. It's a real way for Netanyahu to have his place in history. Also, because of the security implications that I talked about before, annexation of the Jordan Valley has long been a consensus policy in Israeli politics. Esther rightly mentioned that there's been a poll that came out saying that Israelis don't actually want to annex the Jordan Valley right now. It's just important to note they don't want to annex it unilaterally. So this annexation of the Jordan Valley has been a consensus policy. Israeli governments led by Labour, led by Kadima, have all tried to annex the Jordan Valley as part of peace agreements with the Palestinians. The change here in the Netanyahu administration is we're talking about unilateral administration, but Netanyahu is basically saying Palestinians be damned, if we can get an agreement with them or not, it doesn't matter. We need to annex the Jordan Valley and we need to do that now. Basically his hand has been strengthened by COVID-19 crisis. Just before this happened, I was reading op-eds every day in my inbox saying the Netanyahu era is over. These elections are showing that there's a stalemate and Netanyahu is not going to be able to break it. Actually, in Israel, we've handled the COVID-19 crisis very well compared to the UK in particular. I mean, in Israel, we've had less than 250 deaths. Think about that in comparison to the number of deaths in the UK, primarily because Netanyahu took a risk and led the lockdown, the call for lockdown very, very early, even though he was criticized at the time. I think even in retrospect, people are saying, look, this is a responsible, serious leader who took these risks. Now, as a result of this, we now have the so-called Corona emergency government, as they say, Benny Gantz, whose basically only campaign promise was not to sit in a Netanyahu-led government, has now broken that promise and sat in a Netanyahu-led government. Important to note as well that Benny Gantz's election platform, during the campaign, he did actually call for annexing the Jordan Valley, illustrating that this is considered a consensus policy in Israeli politics. Now, he wants to annex it as part of an agreement with the Palestinians, not unilaterally. However, he still wants to annex it, which makes it, which gives it this sort of legitimacy of being within the national consensus. Even if Gantz's party and some of these center-left parties that have joined the government, like the Labour Party, back out of it and won't vote for Netanyahu's annexation bill, it looks like Bibi still has the numbers in the Knesset with opposition parties like Avigdor Lieberman's far-right or right-wing Yisrael Beitenu party saying in advance that they would back the policy. So even if there's dissent in the coalition, it's looking like Netanyahu has the numbers. And most critically, we have the Trump administration and the Trump plan, the so-called deal of the century. Now, Trump's plan actually calls for allowing Israel to annex 30% of the West Bank, the Jordan Valley, and the western part of the West Bank that borders Israel. Normally, within Israel's center and left, politicians have said for many years, look, I want to annex the Jordan Valley, but I'm worried about the fallout from the US. I'm worried about Israel's international relations and the damage this will do us. With the Trump White House in power, this completely undermines and obliterates this argument, because Israel's center and left can't say, look at the damage this will do to our alliance in all but name with America, if the Americans are saying, go ahead and do it. Go and annex parts of the West Bank. We don't mind. So there's that critical factor. And that also influences, by the way, the timing when we're talking about July. We have the US presidential election coming up later on in 2020. So Netanyahu is very, very keen to get this annexation done and dusted, just in case Biden manages to beat Trump and replace the Republican administration with a more sort of conventional Democrat White House. But then we actually have to think about what this means. What does annexation mean? If you're on the right of Israel's politics, or if you are Benjamin Netanyahu somehow, this is a fantastic thing to do. This is a historic gesture that links the Jewish people to their ancestral home. It increases Israel's security. And as I said, most importantly, it won't harm Israel's international relations too much, because the US has already heavily hinted that they will back it. I suggest you take this narrative with a pinch of salt, because I'd say that on the ground, this will actually achieve very little. It's a symbolic gesture. It's exactly the same as when the Trump administration acknowledged Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, or moved the embassy to Jerusalem. There was a lot of fanfare, a lot of noise about it, but what did it accomplish for Israel? Did it make Israel more secure? Did it increase Israel's legitimacy? The answer is no, not really. It didn't really do anything on the ground. When we talk about Israel occupying the West Bank, they do occupy most of the West Bank. But if you go to the settlements, especially the bigger settlements like Ariel, this feels like Israel. There's not a different legal system within the settlements. It's all the schools are part of the Ministry of Education. You can go there, there's post offices, there's all the chain stores that you'd find within Israel. So this basically de facto is Israel and feels like Israel. Applying Israeli law is basically a symbolic gesture, because Israeli law has already been in place in these settlements. It's not apart from some sort of very isolated outposts that aren't even hooked up to the electricity grid. It's not the Wild West in the middle of Ariel. It feels like a quite boring suburban town. In terms of the security case, I think the security argument is also very flimsy, because Israelis have fixated on the Jordan Valley for a very, very long time. However, the border with Jordan has actually been Israel's most secure border since 1967. When you compare it to the border with Gaza, the border with Egypt, like, you know, the Sinai Peninsula, when you compare it Israel's border with Lebanon, even now Israel's border with Syria, the Jordan Valley is very quiet because Israel has a peace treaty with Jordan. Even before Israel had a peace treaty with Jordan, it had a de facto secret series of understandings with the Jordanians that meant the Jordanians didn't even go to war with Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So there's been really no need to annex the Jordan Valley. I think this argument, and you know, even though it does fall within national consensus, you can pick apart this security argument relatively easily. Okay, so an Iraqi army came through there in 1967. Israel, by the way, had no problem defeating said Iraqi army. And, you know, times change. Threats, technology, and strategy changes. We don't say in the UK today that we have to fortify the English Channel because we're worried about the French coming and invading us, or we're worried about France falling to the Spaniards who are then going to push up and invade us through there. You know, times and threats change. And this is the case in the Middle East, even when Israel has a much more significant security threat than, say, the UK. Finally, as Esther mentioned, even though Israelis want to annex the Jordan Valley in theory, they're less interested in doing it in practice. Israel at the moment doesn't feel any security threat from Jordan. Israelis don't feel a need to. Even the military have expressed reservations about annexation for reasons that you wouldn't think, actually. When Israel's army, the IDF, operates in the West Bank, it's operating outside of Israel. Therefore, what it does is, shall we say, legally more dubious than how it acts inside Israel. The security apparatus within Israel is bound much more by the rule of law and by liberal constraints than it is when it operates outside of Israel. So voices in the military are saying, hang on a minute, if we actually apply Israeli law and make these parts of the West Bank part of Israel, what will this mean operationally? Will we be able to do what we've been doing for a long time? The answer is probably not. And the last point is the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, this basically undermines the Palestinian Authority because you're saying, we're not interested in negotiating with you. We're going to pull the rug under you and take away and annex 30% of the West Bank, land that we'd actually promised to you in previous negotiations. Israel's never, in the last 30 years, put forward a plan that would call for such large-scale annexation. Trump's plan is actually much more generous to Israel than the offers that Israelis have made, Israeli governments have made to Palestinians in the past. So this is a big problem for the Palestinian Authority. And how does that affect Israeli security in terms of cooperation? Because the Palestinian Authority, the reason the West Bank is quiet is because the Palestinian Authority cooperates with and has a very, very close working relationship with the IDF, completely independent of politics so far. So, you know, even the Netanyahu has been in power for a long time and regularly delegitimizes and incites against the Palestinian Authority. This relationship, the security relationship, has remained very strong. Would it remain as resilient in the event of an annexation? I'm very skeptical. So you've basically had my 10 cents on the annexation argument, and I'm more than happy to answer questions from all of you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was a very much needed, I think, overview on about 1,000,001 different things. I hope that it was clear. It was certainly a good amount of information for me as well. So the way we're going to do this is take questions in threes. So the first questions are from Toby, Noam, and Jonathan. Does that sound all right, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, brilliant. So Toby's question is, how has an almost broken government and election process in Israel affected the talks between Israel and the Palestinian territories? Noam's question is relating to Hebron. What are the plans re annexation in Hebron? And Jonathan's question is, if I can find it, what does a third intifada look like? What does a third intifada look like during a COVID pandemic? to what extent does it affect or make less likely any kind of intervention, international or Arab intervention?
Sorry, I'm just furiously trying to scribble the points down so I don't brush over them. Okay, do you want me to answer now?
Yes, please.
Okay, fantastic. Some very good opening questions. I'll go with the first one. How has Israel's broken government affected relations with the Palestinian Authority? The answer is, to be honest with you, not very much. But that's only for the negative reason of there were no negotiations with the Palestinian Authority when Israel's government was not, quote unquote, broken, when it was supposedly working very well, simply because it was a very right-wing government. And basically the people that are running the government today continue to be the same people. They're not interested in negotiations with or specifically a deal with the Palestinian Authority, because that would involve Israel leaving large portions of the West Bank. It would involve Israel making concessions on things like Jerusalem, on settlements, and withdrawal, and that is just not going to happen anytime soon with this government's current composition. The only negotiations we've really been seeing of any substance are secret negotiations between Israel and Hamas, not the Palestinian Authority, over a long-term ceasefire. So, you know, this government has consistently undermined the Palestinian Authority. It's saying the Palestinian Authority is not a partner for peace. They're, you know, we often point to anti-Semitic images they show on TV, in textbooks, but then we're happy to negotiate with Hamas, whose charter until not very long ago said that Jews are responsible for the French Revolution and just about every bad thing that's happened in world history. So, you know, go figure. It's a pretty contradictory policy. In terms of Hebron, it's impossible to say what the actual plans are for annexation yet, because as I say, there's not actually been a delineation of these plans yet. We've heard a lot of talk about it. We know it's almost certainly going to involve the Jordan Valley, because that's the least controversial part of the West Bank that Israel could probably try and annex in terms of the Israeli domestic consensus. Hebron is a different kettle of fish. Yes, it has that ideological resonance because of the Cave of the Patriarchs. It has settlements and it has a Jewish community there that Israel established. But the chances of Israel annexing Hebron, I would say, are slim, just because of the amount of Palestinians within the territory. From what I recall, Trump's plan actually calls for most of the Hebron Hills, where there are many Israeli settlements, going to Palestinian control, which has actually angered many settlers. So far, Hebron is off the table. The last question, in terms of a third intifada during a COVID pandemic, I mean, you know, shooting from the hip, I would say this is very unlikely, though I think making any sort of definite judgment on what's going to happen in the Middle East is basically a way to undermine your own legitimacy, because we always, as analysts, we tend to be wrong about future developments in the Middle East. I think with, you know, you see with the COVID pandemic here, what you see in the UK, all the issues people were talking about previously are now on the back burner, because we're all focused on coronavirus. In the UK, I mean, who remembers Brexit anymore for the time being? We're all talking about COVID. And it's the same in Israel. So it's less likely that we're going to see a Palestinian intifada, more likely that Netanyahu is going to very strategically use the COVID pandemic and sort of this gravitas he's gained as a statesman who's helped prevent many Israeli deaths. He's going to use that to try and shove annexation in very, very quickly and try and get it done as soon as possible before anyone notices. I think that's most important. In terms of international pressure, I think there'll be a lot less of it, because, as you say, we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic. People are busy. People are distracted. So it's not a third intifada that I'm worried about right now. It's about the Netanyahu government using the COVID pandemic to try and advance its narrow right-wing agenda.
Thank you so much, Rob. So we have got 3 more questions from Matan, Ari, and James. Matan's question is, if the annexation won't create a big change in terms of the future 2-state solution and the reality on the ground, why is all of the Jewish progressive world on its feet against it? How will annexation affect Israeli diaspora relations? So that's the first question from Matan. Then from Ari, Would land annexed this summer be likely to be off the table in a future peace deal? Then the third question from James, is there no argument that we cannot evacuate the large settlement blocks due to large numbers in any case? So surely delaying annexation is delaying the inevitable. Does that third one make sense?
Yes, I'm just trying to scribble it down again before I end up forgetting with my goldfish brain.
I can send it to you in the chat, Rob, the questions.
Perfect, thank you. See, I'm such a technophobe. Thank you. So I'll start with the first ones while Maya is helping me out there. So with Matan's question, the first question, I think was basically two questions. He mentioned that they thought that annexation wouldn't make too much of a difference to the two-state solution. I'm going to have to take issue with that part of the question. I think annexation would make a difference. Yes, we're not talking about annexing the entire West Bank. We're not saying, you know, the two-state solution is dead overnight, but Israel is annexing 30% or is probably going to annex 30% of the West Bank. This is more territory, as I said, than Israel has even envisioned keeping under its control for a very, very long time. At Camp David, when we couldn't reach an agreement with the Palestinians, Israel offered somewhere between 90 to 92% of the West Bank. Ehud Olmert, the last Israeli prime minister to basically be interested in making a deal with the Palestinians, the last one before Netanyahu, offered Mahmoud Abbas between 94 and 96% of the West Bank. We still couldn't get a deal. So if we're offering the Palestinians 70% of the West Bank, I think the chances of a deal are negligible. The two-state solution does not disappear overnight, but most of these great ideas die with a whimper, not with a bang. You know, we've been undermining the two-state solution with settlement growth for decades now, and it's made a tangible difference on the ground. And the real threat there is that it doesn't kill the two-state solution overnight, but it's slowly and incrementally changing realities on the ground. How will it affect Israel diaspora relations? Honestly, to be as someone that's lived in Israel for the last 6 years, I imagine that you guys are probably more better placed to answer this question than I am, but you know, hey ho, I'll give it a shot. I think in terms of the American Jewish community, there will be an uproar because the American Jewish community, though it is that the Orthodox community in the States is growing, the US Jewish community is overwhelmingly liberal and is against these kind of unilateral final status moves and has historically been against annexation. So I think you'll see protests from American Jewish communities, probably a muted response from AIPAC because it knows that it's got to tread a careful tightrope. In the UK Jewish community, I would defer to you guys on that question, but I think it's less important the impact on the diaspora and more important how it would affect international players like the US. As I say, if Biden is in the White House, it will be very different to if Trump is in the White House. And then the final question, not the final question, sorry, another one of the questions, would annexation this summer basically take this territory off the table? Not inherently, but it would make it much harder for Israel to withdraw. Take, for example, the Golan Heights. Israel annexed the Golan Heights in the early 80s. There was a good chance that Israel was going to give this up in negotiations with Syria in the 90s. Now, Ehud Barak, who was prime minister at the time, basically backed down at the last minute because opinion polls were released showing huge majorities of Israelis in favor of keeping the Golan. Why? Because we know the Golan. We like the Golan. We go hiking in the Golan. All the summer houses are in the Golan. All the places you can go for nice trails and walks and all that kind of thing. It's not the same in the parts of the West Bank. They're still, they're still seen as dangerous, left-wing Israelis. A lot of left-wing Israelis still don't go there. Once you start to apply sovereignty and basically make this symbolic gesture saying this is our territory, then things could change, and it will definitely be harder for Israel to give it up. In terms of Maya, did you send me the last question, by the way? Sorry, as I said, I'm a bit of a technophobe, so I'm trying.
No, that's fine. So the last question was, I'll just read it. I think it will be quicker. From Chania, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. The question is, what is the Palestinian Authority and does it have a political leaning?
What is the Palestinian Authority? So in terms of some background, the Palestinian Authority was set up as part of the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization led by Yasser Arafat. The idea was to turn the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was basically a non-state actor, some saw it as terrorists, you could definitely say they're involved in terrorist activities. The idea was to turn them from this sort of non-state anomaly into a quasi-state, to give them responsibility and power within the West Bank. Israel basically said, because of the first Intifada at the time, we don't want to control this much territory anymore. The answer is to give it to the Palestinians. Let the Palestinians manage the Palestinians' own affairs. And that's how the Palestinian Authority came into being. And it continues to do so today by repressing and suppressing Hamas and Islamic Jihad and more extremist activities within the West Bank. So that basically answers the political leaning. It was formerly a resistance organization against Israel. It now has deep-rooted cooperation with Israel on security and an economic level and an elite level, and it is involved, and it's in its best interest to control extremist groups just as much as it is in Israel's interest. Any annexation or very large changes to the status quo that are very salient will damage and are a risk to this relationship, which is so important for Israel's security.
Thank you very much, Rob. So we've got another 3 questions. We've got a follow-up question from Hanya, which is, what is the PA, what's the Palestinian Authority's reaction to Netanyahu's plan to annex parts of the West Bank? How have they reacted? And then we've got questions from Daniel and Georgie. Daniel's question is there a current consensus on how the annexation would be funded in a post-COVID-19 economy? And Georgie's question is, to what extent could a future left-wing or centrist government unannex parts of the West Bank or take back any land grabs, i.e. are the decisions made in the coming week likely to be permanent? Do you need any of those repeated? Have you got them
I'm good. I'm going to manage to get them all in time this time.
Brilliant.
So I'll answer the last question first, because I think it's basically very similar to the one that was asked in the last round. The idea, is this permanent? Is annexation complete? Is it a fact that we can't undo? No, it's not. It can be undone, but it just makes withdrawal much harder because it legitimizes Israel's control over those territories. So, is it something that, does that mean these territories are going to be part of Israel forever? Not necessarily, but then, you look today, as I say, you look at parts of the Negev, places like Beersheba, down south. These were not parts of the territory that the UN gave to Israel in its partition plan in the 40s. However, Israel then captured them in fighting, annexed them, and today it's impossible to imagine Israel leaving these parts of the territory. These because it's not weird Wild West backwaters. These are parts of Israel. So if you make a territory a part of Israel, you're not saying this is a problematically occupied foreign territory that we should leave at some point. You're saying we're basically leaving parts of the core territory itself, which means that domestic dissent is likely to be higher, and it's just basically much less likely to happen, though not impossible, I should add. Is there a consensus on how it should be funded? What a fantastic question, especially in a COVID era. I don't have an answer to this because I'm not an economist. However, I do advise that you start advising Israel's left parties on an opposition and, basically put this question to them, because this is a great way to undermine Netanyahu's argument for annexation. Say, look, we're dealing with a pandemic. The world is in the middle of a global pandemic. Do we really need to be annexing territories that are not giving us any security problems and haven't given us any security problems for a very long time? What are the economic costs of that policy? It's definitely going to cost money. It's going to involve a lot of committees, a lot of strife, a lot of tension, a lot of demonstrations, and a lot of debates. The question is it worth it? And I would say, frankly, no. How has the PA reacted? As you can imagine, the PA is not very happy about this. The PA is having the rug pulled from under them by their collaborative party, Israel. They've basically said that if the annexation were to be enacted, they would cease all security cooperation with Israel. They would basically hand back the keys to the Palestinian Authority and tell the Israelis, all right, you know what, you want the West Bank, you have it. You want the Jordan Valley, have Hebron as well. Have Nablus, have Jenin, have these parts of the territory that you've never wanted because you can't have your cake and eat it. Whether they'll do that or not remains to be seen, because they've threatened it many times in the past. So it's a bit like the boy who cried wolf. Nevertheless, I think the chances of Israel and the PA having the same relationship after annexation are very slim.
Thank you so much, Rob. We have got tons of questions. This is brilliant. Let's try to get through them. So first one from James. Sorry we missed your last one in that round, James. Not intentional. So that question from James was, is there an argument that we can evacuate large settlement blocks due to large numbers? And is it possible to delay the annexation to do so? That was the first question. Second question is from Yoni. Annexation plans have had pushbacks from many governments and international organizations. How likely is it that sanctions or restrictions will be imposed on Israel if they go ahead with annexation? And then the third question from Natalie. What is likely to happen to Palestinians living under the land that is annexed? Is it expected that they would be offered Israeli citizenship? Those are your three, Rob.
Fantastic. Those are some great questions, by the way. Let's go with the first one that we missed out last time. Is there an argument that, we can't leave these large settlement blocks because there's simply too many settlers in them? It just can't be done. Like anything else, the more settlers you have in a territory, the less likely it is that Israel is going to leave that territory. It's going to make leaving those settlements much harder. However, the settlers, first of all, are not evenly dispersed throughout the West Bank. They tend to be concentrated, as I said, around Israel's border for security reasons. And the Palestinians have often said that they're going to give up these territories to Israel in the future. So no one really in Israel, including on the left, believes that every single Israeli settlement should be evacuated. On the other hand, by the way, Israel pulled out 9,000 settlers in 2005 from the Gaza Strip and the northern West Bank, and 8,000 settlers in the late 70s and early 80s from the Sinai Peninsula. On both occasions, people made the same argument. They said that we can't leave those territories. There's too many Israelis there. Jews cannot uproot Jews. This is just not something that we can do. And you know what? We did it. We managed to do it. So I think if the rewards are great enough, if there is actually a chance to end the conflict with the Palestinians, Israelis will be willing to make those painful concessions, including many settlers, by the way. Not all settlers are ideological, right-wing religious zealots or what have you, as you might think they are. Can we delay the annexation? Definitely, and I think this depends on the machinations within Israel's emergency coronavirus coalition government. Who knows, to be honest with you? Who knows what Benny Gantz is going to argue for? He spent, as I said, a long time saying he'd never sit in a coalition with Netanyahu. He's now gone and sat in a coalition with Netanyahu. Will he have some sort of conversion on the road to Damascus and go the other way and suddenly decide that he's going to stop Netanyahu and stop this annexation? Maybe, but then, as I say, it's very difficult because it does have a majority within the Knesset from right-wing parties in the opposition, like Yisrael Beitenu. I think the chances of annexation happening in the near future are relatively high, but I don't think that it's inevitable. With Corona, with the pandemic as it is, who would have thought about it? Who would have thought that this is what we'd be talking about a couple of months ago? And now it's, here we are sitting on Zoom rather than in a nice meeting room. What are the chances of sanctions or restrictions on Israel? This basically depends on who's in power in the White House, because even critical actors like the European Union have always deferred to the US on the Israel-Palestine conflict. They've basically taken a back seat and said, we'll follow the Americans on this. So if the Americans under Joe Biden say, this is not kosher, we're not having it, we want, if the annexation hasn't happened by then, they have a chance to stop it. There is a genuine chance of a very strong chance, I'd say, of there being a significant strain in relations between Israel and the US. If Trump's in power, who knows? Who knows what Trump thinks and how Trump makes his decisions? But I think it's very unlikely that he would pick a fight with Israel on this issue, especially on the run-up to his re-election, because a lot of his supporters are evangelical Christians who basically think that whatever Netanyahu in Israel does is fantastic, even if they don't necessarily understand it so much. In terms of Palestinians in the land that's being annexed, that is an excellent question to which I do not have an answer. The chances are that Israel would have to give them citizenship. I don't see any way out of this for Israel. You'd be talking about the maximum number of Jews, and in terms of land getting annexed, as I said before, the maximum number of Jews, the minimum number of Arabs. There will, however, be Palestinian Arabs within those territories that suddenly come under Israeli sovereignty. They will almost certainly have to become Israeli citizens, because even with the government as it is, even Netanyahu in power for so long, I can't, maybe call me a hopeless optimist, I can't see a scenario in which Israel basically enacts apartheid so blatantly.
Thanks for that, Rob. I'm just going to jump in before Esther would share the probably what would be the last round of 3 questions. And just to say, we've both tried as best as we can to be on top of the chat, but you all have so many good questions. So if we've missed your question, please write to me in the chat. I'm under Yachad UK, and let me know and we'll try to squeeze you in. I just want to say quite a few people asked about the role of the US in this, and just to say that this evening Yachad would host a webinar with the president of J Street, which is the pro-Israel, pro-peace group of American Jews who've now endorsed Biden, and he would talk of how a Biden presidency can impact the situation in Israel-Palestine. So if you're interested in this, please join us later tonight. I'll share details in the chat. And also just to say, it would be really great if we can take a group Zoom pic if we can. So I'm going to take one now. So if that's
Smile, everyone.
okay with you.
Look interested.
Yeah, exactly. Say cheese to the camera. Thank you very much. And now I'll hand over to Esther.
Amazing. Thanks, guys. You all look great. So the final 3 questions, we've got the first one from Rory. Around the argument of we pulled out of Gaza and got rockets, which was only a decade ago, how would Israel be assured that the same won't happen with a West Bank withdrawal if their withdrawal of Gaza was based on giving trust, especially when the Jordan Valley overlooks Israeli cities? So the next question is from Ellie. Ellie's question is, could you talk a little bit about the significance of Netanyahu's indictment in relation to annexation in general and the legitimacy of annexation? And then from Ivan, we have, is there a chance of an effective opposition movement to annexation happening within Israel?
So there we go. Okay, I've got them all. Good, fantastic. Just one point, by the way, as one of the questions was pointing out that Jordan Valley overlooks Israeli cities. Important to note, the Jordan Valley is on the east of the West Bank. So the Jordan Valley doesn't overlook Israeli cities. However, I think what you're talking about is the West Bank's western border, which does overlook, as I said before, Israel's commercial and urban heartland. Now, Israel, for those reasons, has been not willing to withdraw from most of that territory. And when we talk, when I said that Olmert and Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians about 90 to 96% of the West Bank, the other percent they didn't offer them tends to be that part of the territory along the border with Israel. So I think the chances of Israel withdrawing from that territory are basically nil. The chances of a full withdrawal to 1967 borders is incredibly unlikely. Going back to the question, to the comment and question about we pulled out of Gaza and we got rockets, this is something that I will talk about until I am blue in the face, happily. We didn't pull out of Gaza and get rockets. This is Israel's narrative. This is basically the right-wing Israeli narrative that the Israeli public has bought for various reasons. There were rockets before Israel was in Gaza. There were rockets after Israel left Gaza. They did go up, but they were going up, by the way, while Israel was in Gaza. There's been years since we left Gaza where we've had less rockets than when we were in Gaza. The only reason people focus on rockets now is because Israelis aren't being killed within the Gaza Strip. Katyushas are horrible, okay? These rockets are awful. They really disrupt civilian life. They cause trauma, and they basically make it impossible to live a normal life. However, they very, very, very rarely kill anyone. When Israel was in the Gaza Strip, in the settlements, and defending these narrow pathways between Palestinian villages and towns and cities, Palestinians were killing Israelis much, much easier, and they didn't have to fire Katyusha rockets. All they had to do was basically pick up an AK and start shooting an Israeli car that was going past. So Israel's casualties actually declined cumulatively since Israel left Gaza. And there were rockets before and there were rockets afterwards. Again, that's another topic for another time, but I don't think that this is a valid argument. Even in the West Bank, there are clear security risks to withdraw. But I think the benefits, the security benefits, continued cooperation with the Palestinian Authority, an end to the conflict, an end to Palestinian claims, and a more robust relationship, which we'll probably get with the Arab world, with the EU and the United States, outweigh any of the risks by a long shot. But again, another discussion for another time. In terms of Netanyahu's indictment, I think Netanyahu's indictment is critical to his pursuit of annexation. He knows the writing is on the wall. You know, he's not an idiot. In fact, he's a genius. He's a very, very clever politician. I wish he was on Israel's center left because he's very, very effective, much more effective than anyone that we've got. However, he knows that the writing is on the wall. He knows that his game is up. He's not going to be able to stay in power forever, even if the Knesset passes a law making the Prime Minister immune from prosecution. It can go to the Supreme Court, who will probably rule it out of order. In the next few years, Netanyahu is going to be shown the door. As a result of that, he wants to pursue annexation in order to have some sort of tangible legacy on Israeli history, because up till now, despite being Israel's longest serving prime minister, he's not done very much. You know, he's a status quo guy. He always keeps things the same, unlike many of Israel's other prime ministers. And since he's been, he's had these legal troubles, he's swung to the right. That's primarily because his coalition partners know that he's more reliant on them. He needs them. He needs their support. He needs them to vote against any moves, any laws in the Knesset that would make it easier for him to be indicted. So it's pushing him further to the right and making annexation more likely. Final point, effective opposition to annexation within Israel. This is basically our moment. You know, those of us who believe in a two-state solution, those of us who believe that Israel does have a Palestinian partner, those of us who believe that the security benefits of leaving the West Bank are higher than remaining in it. This is our sort of fight or flight moment to decide who we are, what we stand for, and whether we have a chance of replacing the government. As British Jews, it's very important for you to continue lobbying, you know, for example, the Board of Deputies, in order to make them take a stand against this. You know, we are reliant on this support from the diaspora. It really helps us, and God knows we need it, okay? At the moment, the reality in Israel, on Israel's center-left, is frankly appalling. It's been split. Benny Gantz has joined the coalition. We have no leader. Benny Gantz was the first person who looked like he could replace Netanyahu as prime minister. He genuinely, even though I never voted for him, a lot of people think he looked very prime ministerial. And now he's basically completely sold out all of his principles and sat in the government. So in terms of an opposition, there isn't much opposition to anything the government's doing because it's got a super majority at the moment. So we need, as I say, this is the time when we need support from the diaspora to help more than ever before.
And let's wrap it up there. Rob, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much for that very detailed summary of the current issue of annexation at the moment. Well, I suppose it was a bit more than a summary, wasn't it? And thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. Apologies that we could not get through all of them. Just at the end there, Rob said how important it was for us as, you know, Jews in the diaspora to be lobbying our communal institutions, and one way that you can do this is through a communal youth letter to the Board of Deputies, which has recently been released. Maya sent, or somebody will send a link to the Zoom chat, which you can check out the letter, and that's a really, really good way of ensuring that kind of a youth movement voice can be heard as well. So I hope everybody found that interesting and useful. And once again, Rob, thank you so much. Endless appreciation. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And by the way, you said the thing better than I did about lobbying communal institutions. If anyone is really bored in lockdown and wants to carry on the conversation, you can find my email address on the King's website. Just Google Rob Geist Pinfold. It's probably the first thing that comes up. So, you know, if you really want to help make lockdown more fun, please continue emailing me with questions. I'll be happy to answer them.